Welcome to another episode of On the History Trail. I'm your host and tour guide, Mark Nonestied. On today's episode, we will explore the world of antique glass bottles and bottle collecting. Bottles have long fascinated collectors. They are one of the oldest collected antiques. Serious research on classifying antique bottles was begun back in the 1920s and 30s. And in 1941, George and Helen McKeown published American Glass, one of the earliest reference books on the subject. Bottle collecting would expand in the 1960s and 70s, and today, many bottle collecting clubs can be found throughout the United States. But what is it about bottles that make them special? Perhaps it's their color, shapes, uses, or historical connotations. Whatever it may be, early bottles often appear frozen in time. As we examine them, we can see how the molten glass gave them their own fluid characteristics, and perhaps it's that individuality that sets them apart. We will talk with Joe Butewicz from the New Jersey Antique Bottle Club, who will walk us through the world of antique bottles. We will learn about the history of bottle making, the different types of bottles, how to tell how old they are, and where to find and collect antique bottles. So sit back and relax and follow me as we travel on the History Trail. Welcome to the show, Joe. You brought a phenomenal collection of antique bottles here. We know that New Jersey has a rich glassmaking heritage, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how bottles were made. What's the process by which they made some of these bottles?
Well, the process goes back to ancient times where Phoenician sailors found bricks and clumps of molded sand that was melted from fires, and it went right on through Roman times and into New Jersey. Bottles were made by using cullet, which is broken glass, and a mixture of soda lime, potash, and heat. And then when the glass was molten, they would take glass from what they call the glory hole, or the glass batch, and affix some to a blowpipe. And then they would have a smooth piece of iron, and they would make their first, not a bubble, but they would make their first form. It's called a parison, and that smooth piece of iron is called a marver. They would take the glass on the blowpipe and roll it over the marver to get their parison shape, and then they would put a small bubble of air into the blowpipe. And then depending on what form they would use, they would then use the blowpipe accordingly. They would swing it or blow more air in, and generally they would get a form, globular type form, and then they would possibly paddle it to make it round. They could paddle it to make it square, and then they would, when they had the desired shape, they would have a helper or an apprentice come and put a pontal on the base to hold the bottle from when it was snapped off the rod.
Okay.
Once it was snapped off the rod, they would then take another gather of glass and affix a top. So the bottles are made in several stages. Molded bottles then became...
So this process that you're describing, they're literally making it by hand?
Yes, exactly. By hand, the same way that the bottles were made in Roman times.
And so when do they switch over to blowing things into molds?
They started using some dip molds or case molds just to give a little shape, even in Roman times, but they didn't have molds really that made a well-defined shoulder. A lot of that work was done with a paddle, free-blown form, and then paddled. Molds became popular in the United States around 1815. That's when the molds really took off. Keene, New Hampshire, Marlborough Street Glassworks was probably the first place in the country where they were using molds, although it wasn't the first glass house. The first successful glass house was in Salem County on Alloways Creek, and it was run by Caspar Wister, who was a German immigrant, and he was actually a button merchant in Philadelphia.
So this is South Jersey, where his factory was located?
Yes, it was on Alloways Creek in Salem County. It was not the first glass house in America. That was in Jamestown, but it wasn't successful. In Jamestown, they brought over, I believe, 6 or 8 Polish immigrants, and the Polish blowers were able to blow glass, but the enterprise itself wasn't successful. So they couldn't make a profit and send glass back to England. After that, there was the Mannheim Enterprises out in Pennsylvania by Baron von Stiegel, who had 3 successful glass houses there, successful to a moderate degree, and also Frederick Amelung in Maryland. But actually before Stiegel and Amelung was Wister, and Wister was about 1730.
And why New Jersey? Was it the right ingredients there?
Yes, it was a combination of transportation on the river and the rich banks of sand along the Mullica River and Maurice River in that area. And there are a lot of glass houses sprung up there. And the first one was there because of the abundant supply of good, clean sand and the transportation to get the finished product to Philadelphia and other markets.
Great, great. I know here there's a wide variety of different types of bottles. For bottle collectors, are there many different categories?
Yes, there's a wide variety of categories. Over here on the table are some figural bitters, and we have Drake's Cabin represented, the Suffolk bitters, which came in a pig form, and the Indian Maiden, which was Brown's celebrated Indian herb bitters. These companies put out bottles in figural form, not only because they were eye-appealing to the customers, but because there was liquor tax, and tax on alcohol became so prohibitive that it was easier just to sell your alcohol under a different name, hence the term bitters. So that's a very popular collecting category because of the nice shapes of the bottles. Next to the Indian Maiden is a medicine bottle, and that's a large category also, that some people collect only medicine bottles. Some people only collect historical flasks, which are the bottles on the table next to you. That style bottle is for whiskey, and many important events were captured on them. Most famous was in 1824 when Lafayette came to the United States for the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And that year, into the middle of 1825, Lafayette visited every state in the Union at that time, which there were 28 states, and he visited every one of them. So they commemorated the event to make a profit by selling the whiskey at a higher rate, and people had a souvenir or keepsake from when they would go to see him at his speeches in his various locations.
So almost a collectible item from the time period.
Exactly, and that's why a lot of American historical flasks are not found whole in the ground. They're only found in the broken state because people basically rinsed them out and put them on the windowsill, and that's where they stayed in a lot of the old homes, and then they went into antique shops and then into bottle collections. Another category is soda bottles, which are on the table here.
Yeah, I see you brought a nice collection of different types of soda bottles over a long time span too.
Yeah,
how they've evolved.
They kind of start from the end here with the one closest to me, and they go around in a chronological sequence, basically due to technological changes, and we go all the way out to the bottle on the other end, the light green one, which is the last style of bottle with a crown top or a screw top, and then we went into the plastic bottles.
Okay, so the earliest one there is from what time period?
It's about 1845, and it's from a company called Bell and Bennett in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And then it follows with an S.W. Bell bottler example in the aqua color, and that's a Civil War age bottle, about 1860. The third one in is is a gravitating stopper type, and that's the one right here, where there's a wooden stopper inside with a rubber ring. Sometimes the stoppers were glass, and it actually kept the closure by gas pressure pushing up, trying to push the stopper out of the bottle.
Huh. So literally the carbonation is...
Carbonation was the stoppering mechanism.
Oh, interesting. Huh.
And if you push down on the stopper, you uncarbonated it and had to shake it up again to get it to stopper again. Then we went to the wire stopper, which is the Hutchinson. That's the one right here. The gasket was affixed to the end of this wire, and then you just simply had a hook tool that you pulled it up when you wanted to restopper it. Then we went to Painter's patented cap seal, which was about 1892. And this bottle's still handmade. And then we went into the Deco era, the 1920s, where the bottles got real fancy. And of course, your hobble skirt Coke bottle was from the 20s on out to the 50s and 60s. And then we had the painted label bottles as represented by the Pepsi. And then we finished off with the very thin walled bottles right before plastic.
Okay. So I noticed the earlier bottles have embossed decoration on it, and that the Pepsi Cola bottle that you were pointing at, the ornamentation on there is literally painted on.
It's a pyroglaze technique where the paint is put on and then it's glazed so it doesn't wash off or it doesn't scratch off easily. And it's easier to make the bottles without embossings because the molds are cheaper. So everything got cheaper and cheaper on the way out, and the bottles had less of a process about them, if you will. They were made by machine. The bottle machine came into play in 1903. There were several machines that weren't successful by Owens and Company, of which merged with another company and became Owens, Illinois. And about 1906, they got a machine that worked really well. But the problem was you had to be a large entity to use the bottle machine because it required, I believe, 12 molds at one time. And the glass was pumped right into the machine, and it was allocated to each mold, measured, and the molds flipped and were made right on the machine. And that's one cutoff point where a lot of bottle collectors won't collect bottles that are machine made. They will only collect bottles that are handmade or blown with a blowpipe.
Okay.
So that's kind of a line in the sand for a lot of people in 1903, 1906.
So you mentioned bitters, medicine, historical flasks, soda bottles. What other kinds of categories are there? Are there people who collect ink bottles? Or?
Oh yes, ink bottle collectors. One of our largest members of the fraternity that collected ink bottles, Bob Mabane, passed away several years ago in Florida, and his collection was auctioned off, and he had some really beautiful examples of ink bottles. He was a very big ink collector, and the ink category is very strong. Probably one reason is the small inkwells have a lot of things going for them as far as collectors like to see. They're colorful, they're small, so that you can set up a display of 30 ink bottles in a small shadow box that's only maybe 24 inches by 30 inches. And people that don't have a lot of room tend to collect ink bottles. There's a lot of categories. Colognes, there's milk bottles that are handmade, and of course milk bottles that are machine made are very popular.
Were there dairies locally in central New Jersey that...
Oh yes, every town had bottlers of milk. Every town pretty much had bottlers of soda. Some towns, such as South Amboy, had a tremendous amount of beer bottlers. The amount of beer bottles from individual bottlers from a town like South Amboy can range probably 50 or 60 different names from the period from 1890 to about 1905. So some towns really had a lot of bottlers, and it was popular.
So not only do we have different categories, but there's a regionalism to collecting also. Is that true? Different areas of the United States or
Absolutely.
Of the state?
The regionalism is a very good point because it goes from town to county to state to national. There's plenty of people who would collect just bottles from South River or New Brunswick. There's other people who would enlarge that to Middlesex County. And there's other collectors that would collect just New Jersey or New York. The guys in Connecticut, They have such a love for their Connecticut glass that they've actually driven the prices of Connecticut historical flasks through the roof. Things that have tripled, quadrupled in the last 4 or 5 years as far as Connecticut glass goes, only because those guys are so pursuant to get the bottles, and they'll seem to pay prices that are far above what's estimated.
So what were some of the different, we were talking about milk bottles, the dairies, what were some of the dairies that were located in the area that have milk bottles?
Well, I know the South River ones because I've always come across a lot of those bottles. There was Algiers, Algiers, Rosen, Chamora, Joseph Chamora. New Brunswick had a wide variety. New Brunswick had the 10 brothers. They had Paulus, which was one of the biggest, the largest, Paulus Dairy. Goes back quite far to hand-blown bottles all the way into basically the end of the era. They went into the slug-plated bottles and the pyro-glazed bottles. Quite a bit. Gerenser from New Brunswick, Schmidt's Dairy. And there's quite a bit. There's several from Monmouth Junction and Jamesburg, and I don't think there's one from Spotswood or East Brunswick. But a lot of the older towns had several, at least 2 milk bottlers.
So if somebody has an antique bottle, how would they be able to tell how old it is? Are there different clues on the bottle that help give the age?
Yes, absolutely. There's the first thing to do is to determine whether it's machine-made or handmade.
Okay.
And the easiest way to do that is look for the mold seam on the side of the bottle. If the mold seam stops up around the middle of the neck and it disappears, that's a telltale sign that the bottle is hand-blown.
Okay.
If the mold seam goes to the very top of the bottle or shifts maybe 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch and then continues to the top, that's the telltale sign of a machine-made bottle.
Okay.
A machine-made bottle will also have what we call the Owens mark on the base, which is usually a round dot in a circle. Unlike a pontil mark, which is a mark that shows the glass gaffer or blower had to pontil the bottle or affix it to a rod in order to apply or finish the top.
Okay.
And I think we have a pontil.
So if I pick up one of these bottles here very carefully, you mentioned the mold line. So we're talking about this line on the side of the bottle. And I'm looking at it and I notice that it does not continue all the way through. It sort of disappears up here on the shoulder. And so that's a clue that this is handmade then?
Absolutely. Okay. The reason it disappears so low is because the bottle was reinserted into the furnace several times to finish the top.
Okay.
And even though the top doesn't look like it has a big gloppy blob on it or anything, when that bottle came out of the mold, the top was long and jagged because when that mold was made, they didn't have a good way to actually terminate the liquid glass when it was molten, and it would come out jagged. So they would have to shear it with a tool called the pucellas.
And that's the top here then?
They'd shear the top, but then it would be uneven. So they would have to reinsert it into the heat and use another tool to smooth it all out. So it would take a cork, and so it would be finished.
Okay, so if this mold line continues straight through, right through to the top of the bottle, we're looking at something that's machine-made?
Yes.
After what time period?
1903.
1903. Okay.
And again, that's only your larger entities at the early stages.
Okay. And you mentioned the pontil mark. We've been talking about the pontil mark. Is that what I'm looking at here at the bottom?
Yes, that's what's called an open pontil, and it's actually a small ring of glass that the gaffer would put onto the marver, and he would affix that ring to his a molten pipe, a red hot pipe that was in the furnace. He'd pull the pipe out, affix the ring, and then affix it to the soft bottle. And generally he had a helper to do that. Then he would have that bottle on a 5 or 6 foot long rod. He'd reinsert it into the furnace. Now the neck is facing in, and he would rotate it, and then he would put it on a chair, very similar to the one you're sitting on, with long arms, long flat arms, and he would roll the blowpipe back and forth with one hand, and with the other hand he would take the appropriate tool and finish the top.
Okay.
Sometimes it included adding glass to make a gloppy top, and like that one, and other times it wouldn't.
So this is an example of where there's another piece of glass added to the top
Yes.
to finish it off. So you're not cutting your lip when you're drinking
Well,
from this.
Exactly. Those other fire polished examples, you won't cut your lip, but the reason for the gloppy top on the whiskey flasks is that they were made for certain merchants in large orders. The large merchants, especially in Philadelphia, would order a certain style flask in a certain mold, in a certain color, with a certain type top, and they would reuse that top, and they would put a team of fellas together, and they would start them off at the beginning of the day, and they'd say, make as many of these as you can and use as little glass as you can.
You're interesting.
So these large liquor houses had these special orders, and the special orders is what caused some of the tops on the add-on tops on the whiskey flasks.
Okay. So tell me a bit about the New Jersey Antique Bottle Club. What's the mission of the organization, and what does it promote?
Well, we started the bottle club in 1996. Mm-hmm. We're 11 years old. Some of the earlier clubs, like I think the oldest club in the country is from Sacramento, California. They started about 35 years ago. We found that there was only one club in the area close enough to get to, and it was meeting in Belmar, and that's the Jersey Shore Bottle Club. Established club, one of the early clubs in the country. I believe they're 32, 33 years old. They're a very early club. But a lot of us didn't want to drive to Belmar and on a regular basis, so we wanted to do something closer to home. So we started meeting at the Knights Columbus in South River, and in the early days, and then we met up with the curator of the East Brunswick Museum, and we were offered a place to meet there, and we thought it was a better fit for the club. And we promote the collecting of antique glass, bottles, hollowware, things of that nature, mm-hmm. made of glass, pressed glass, but mostly predominantly bottles. We started out by having one meeting a month, and now we meet quarterly. Mm-hmm. So we would meet in January, plan for our show in February. We have a show every February, the first Sunday of February, and that's held at the Knights Columbus in South River.
And this is one of the larger, my understanding, it's one of the larger bottle shows in the state.
I would say it's the largest show in the state of New Jersey. And it's a well-attended show. We have dealers come from as far as Virginia, sometimes South Carolina, all the way up to Maine, all along the East Coast, and as far out to western Pennsylvania, that area. So people come from quite a distance.
So if people are interested in collecting bottles, certainly they should get in touch with you and the organization, attend the show. What other resources are there for people who are interested in collecting bottles? Are there publications or auctions, or what else is out there?
Yes, absolutely. There's always shows, as there's a few flyers on the table here. Probably the main answer to that question is the bottle magazine, and this is called Antique Bottle and Glass Collector. It's put out by Jim Hagenbush out in East Greenville, Pennsylvania, and Jim bought I think it was called Old Bottle. It was called Old Bottle Magazine, and he bought that. It was a smaller size magazine, and he changed the format. This magazine has a show calendar in the back, tells you when all the shows are. It has classified, wanted, for sale. If you're looking for a bottle with your family name on it, you can run an ad in here for 10 cents a word, I believe, and you may find your great-grandfather's milk bottle that you've been looking for 20 years. It also gives you some articles about people finding bottles in old buildings, digging them out of the ground, and it gives you auction and show highlights. So this is really the main magazine. It's a very good publication, and it comes out monthly, and the subscription rate's, I believe, $22 a year.
Okay.
The next avenue for collectors to purchase bottles is several auction houses. This is an auction run by Jim also, and it's called Glassworks Auctions. And it has all the categories represented, and I believe he runs about 3 auctions at a time. At a year. And it's a very nice publication. It goes through categories, and it's got basically all different types of bottles. As you can see on the back cover, we've got some American flasks, some scroll flasks, and this particular auction closed Monday night. So that you have your auction houses. Norm Heckler up in Connecticut, his format's a little different. He runs what are called absentee auctions, like Jim runs, and they're represented by mailed flyers to your home that look like this. And again, they're very nicely done. You can get on his mailing list for free, and he'll send you his auction catalogs. And Norm also runs some monthly sales for his dealer friends up at his home in Woodstock Valley, Connecticut. And those are absolute live auctions, which is the way the bottle hobby used to be, and a lot of us wish it was still like that.
I just noticed in the auction catalog, the auction estimates really run the gamut there. There were some that were under $100, and there were some that were several $1,000s. It seems like the price range is quite broad, which I guess is good. People can get involved relatively cheap, and if they want, they can spend lots of money also in this hobby.
That's the fun of it. The fun of it is that you can walk into a bottle show with $20 and walk out with a bag full of bottles that are over 100 years old, or of many different categories. And you can find great things to decorate your windowsill with, or just put a small collection together with. And you know, it's just a fun hobby, because there's something for everyone in the hobby.
Great. And Joe, in the closing minutes of the show, I wanted to ask you personally, how long have you been interested in the hobby?
1972
Yeah.
I started. Yeah, I started in 1972 by, walking back by the old Boy Scout camp along the river, off River Road. And we were walking along, and there were some old foundations, and just kind of pulled on a steel rod that was sticking out of a foundation. A bottle popped out. And we started, that's where it started. And
so what's your favorite type of bottle?
My favorite type of bottle is the American Historical Flask.
These collection here.
Those bottles really are my favorite, and following them are the medicine bottles and soda bottles from before the Civil War. Like the pre-Civil War bottles, anything from 1815 American to the middle, the end of the Civil War, 1865.
Great. Well, Joe, I want to thank you for coming on the show and bringing this collection and telling us the history of bottle making and bottle collecting. And thanks again for joining us.
My pleasure, Mark. Thank you.
Well, I hope that you enjoyed today's episode, and I invite you to learn more about antique bottles and bottle collecting. The New Jersey Antique Bottle Club meets quarterly and can be reached by calling Joe Butewicz at 732-236-9945. The East Brunswick Museum, located at 16 Maple Street in the Township's Historic District, also has a nice collection of historical bottles, and I encourage you to visit and learn more. And of course, you can always post or send a question to the East Brunswick TV website at www.ebpl.org/EBTV. Thank you for joining me, and come along again as we travel on the History Trail.